What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a Psyker build for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader that I am calling Purity in Flame, as we're going to be picking up some pyromancy powers alongside a dogmatic conviction that allow us to absolutely just decimate enemy lines via repeated melee attacks in the realm of a dozen plus a turn once you get going. As a bit of a side note, this particular build was inspired by what they had in mind for Heinrich's, one of the companions' base build. So if you don't want to use this for yourself, it does make a great build for him as well. But I looked at his base build and thought it was pretty cool, but decided I could probably make it a little better, which is what I aimed for. But a few things to note at the beginning. While this build can be used with technically any conviction, the best one to use it with is dogmatic. If you are making dogmatic decisions and going that route and picking up those abilities, it will actually also give us access to the best version of certain items that make this build incredibly effective. And what's more, we are primarily relying on our melee weapons. We're going to be picking up some Psyker powers, but those are mostly for when we are unable to cover the distance to deal any damage. That is to say, we can't move far enough to actually hit something, and as self-buffs. So this is really more about augmenting ourselves with psychic powers rather than focusing on them in particular. But by the end of the game, we'll be dealing outrageous amounts of damage, combined with an incredibly high armor stat and deflection that makes sure we're taking little, if any. But with no further ado, let's jump into what makes this build tick, starting with character creation. The first meaningful choice you make in that regard is your home world, and for this I picked up Imperial World so we could pick up Humanity's Finest, which lets us get a +10 to our willpower right out of the gate. But honestly, you could make pretty much any home world pick work here. Imperial World is just the simplest option. Arguably, you could do better with other ones. Personally, I really like Voidborn. Though Imperial World, in addition to granting us that bonus to our willpower, though technically we could pick any of our stats, we want willpower, it can also grant us later on access to abilities that make running with human characters or fighting Xenos, etc. more effective. And given that this is pretty much a guaranteed dogmatic playthrough, those work out very nicely. Now, for our next big choice, we have our origin. We are, of course, picking Sanctioned Psyker. Though right at character creation, we're not going to pick up Pyromancy. We're going to pick up Biomancer, because this is going to give us access just right here to the things we want from Biomancy immediately, which is the main buff called Iron Arm, which grants us extra strength for the rest of combat every time we use it, alongside multiple talents we'll be picking up along the way, such as Biophysical Distortion and Sanguine Siphon. We will pick up Pyromancer a bit later though. Now, Triumph and Darkest Hour don't matter much, those are roleplay options, pick what you want. But for our archetype, we want Warrior. And then lastly, for our characteristics, we're going to put 2 points into willpower, strength, and weapon skill. Those are our 3 primary characteristics. Though weapon skill is the most important, and that's in terms of leveling up, then willpower, then strength. So this means at character creation, we should have 40 weapon skill, 55 willpower, and 40 strength. You need at least 45 strength to make this build work, but it is our least important stat otherwise. Personally, I like to do it this way because willpower gives you an extra boost to our Psyker abilities, which makes our Iron Arm buff really effective right at the beginning of the game, as opposed to pumping up weapon skill against enemies that are going to be easy to throw down anyway. So just the way I like to do it, you do have a little bit of wiggle room here. Honestly, as long as you're bumping up weapon skill, strength, and willpower, you're good to go. Now from there, let's talk leveling up. Now I'm not going to cover every single level up, as you can level up to level 55 and not all of those levels are particularly important. So I'm going to talk about the most important ones, which is still quite a few of them. However, what I do want to mention right here is what skills you should be taking as you level up. Every once in a while, as you level up, you'll be prompted to pick a skill to increase by 10, and the 3 you want to focus on are Coercion, Athletics, and Carouse. Coercion is the most important one. This is going to work with a piece of armor we have to give us a huge amount of deflection, which is just flat damage reduction. So having a character with high coercion in the specific piece of armor we're going to be using makes that armor the best armor in the game. Now, on the flip side of that, as you level up, you'll also be prompted to occasionally upgrade your characteristics by 5. Now, generally speaking, you want weapon skill, then willpower, then strength. How much you can increase these every rank, if you will, of your archetypes is limited. You'll get to a point where you cannot increase weapon skill any further, and you'll have to shift over to increasing willpower, for instance, until it rolls around to the next archetype choice, which is your advanced archetype at 16 and then exemplar at 36. The one exception to this is that the first time this pops up, we have to pick strength. This is going to bring our strength to 45 out of character creation, which is going to allow us to pick up the heavy armor proficiency that no one gets automatically. You have to take that as a talent later, which means we need 45 strength. And the sooner you get that knocked out, the better. But with those important things out of the way, let's talk about the important levels you need to make this work. Now, your first few levels of any archetype are pretty set in stone. You get a base ability at level 1 and 3. You get your heroic act, which is like an ultimate ability at level 4, etc. But at level 4, we want to pick up biophysical distortion, in addition to our heroic act. This is going to cause any attack we make, either with psychic powers or our weapons, to also poison the enemy, which will then damage them every turn until combat ends. And later on, we can even make it crit, but it's a nice bit of extra damage in the early game for sure. Now then at level 5, we're going to pick up our 1 level of strength that we need to pick up heavy armor, and then at that same level, we're also going to pick up Sanguine Siphon. Sanguine Siphon causes us to gain stacks of that ability by the same name every time we damage something, which then allows us to, upon taking lethal damage, to instead lose stacks of Sanguine Siphon to mitigate that damage until you're at 1 health, which is pretty handy for the early bit of the game, especially on higher difficulties. Though it isn't strictly speaking necessary, I liked it a lot. And then at level 6, we're going to pick up the ability Invigorate, which is a Biomancer healing ability. Early on in the game, this is especially helpful. Once you get to the late game, you probably won't need it just because you'll be killing everything before it becomes much of an issue. But early on, this is especially helpful in mitigating some of the tougher fights before you start to just overwhelm the enemy. And then at level 7, we're going to pick up Psi Rating 1. Psi Rating is a factor that relates to all of our psychic abilities. Most all of them scale off of some form of willpower and your Psi Rating. And having a higher Psi Rating also unlocks the later abilities for your Psykers. So we want that as early as possible. Now, this might have been a slight bug, I'm not sure, but Psi Rating level 1 and 2 are supposed to happen at level 10 and 20 according to their tooltip, but it lets you pick it a little early for some reason. So on the off chance that ever happens to be addressed, you'll pick that up as soon as possible, basically. Now, at level 8, this is where we're going to pick up our heavy armor proficiency. I like to get this knocked out of the way early, though technically the heavy armor we want won't be available until Act 2, which is going to be probably around level 20-ish. You can still, of course, use other heavy armors you find until then. Now, level 9 is a bit interesting. Levels 9 and 15, respectively, are bonuses to your heroic act, in this case, Daring Breach. You want the first 2 options shown here, the ones that give you extra movement, both until the end of combat upon activation, and the one that gives you extra movement points when you kill something. It's very important you pick those at level 9 and 15, respectively. Now, at level 10, I like to pick up Combat Master. This means that enemies don't get any benefit to being better in melee than you, which is especially helpful early on while you're still boosting your weapon skill, but also important later to make sure that our melee character isn't dealing with problems hitting a boss, as you want to make sure you hit as much as possible. And then at level 11, we pick up our Pyromancy. This is going to give us access to the Pyromancer disciplines as a Psyker and be able to pick up those abilities and passives, etc. Also at this level, we can pick up Psi Rating 2, again at a weird level. Not sure if that's a bug or not. At level 13, I like to pick up Swift Movements, which is going to give us extra movement points every turn. Again, we need to focus on getting in range more than anything. And that's the important stuff for our base warrior archetype. Now at level 16, we're going to pick the Assassin archetype out of the 3 available to us. Now, being an assassin does a few things for us, but mostly it just means maximizing melee damage. A lot of this is done through their Seek the Opening ability, their Dispatch heroic act, and just openings in general. You see, assassins have access to the ability to see openings, that is, crosshair-like weak points on your enemies, and if you hit them from that direction, you will deal 10% of their maximum health as extra damage. You'll deal the base amount of normal damage plus that extra, which is huge, of course. Seek the Opening, specifically, that you get at level 16 here, lets you reveal an opening on an enemy, so you can guarantee that that happens. Now at level 17, you'll be able to pick an ability. I like to pick up Death Whisper here, which lets you make a free attack on your turn that deals 25% of your base damage. And while that might not sound like much, it also applies a bleed for the rest of combat. On top of, if you hit somebody with an opening with this, it will still deal 10% of their max health. Now at level 18, I like to pick up Blazing Inferno. This is going to increase our crit chance by 1% until the end of combat every time we deal damage, period, which includes all of the dots. So all of our damage over time abilities that can be ticking down on enemies via our pyromancy powers, just hitting them via biophysical distortion, or the hemorrhage from Death Whisper can now also just passively increase our crit chance every time they deal damage at the start of the turn, plus all of your regular hits. This is a massive increase to crit chance, especially with the amount of times we're going to be hitting the enemy. Now at 19, we pick up the Assassin's heroic ability, Dispatch. This is a good ability, but we're not going to use it a ton. For the most part, we're going to be using Daring Breach from Warrior, but Dispatch is a huge hit against a single target. It can be effective against bosses, but that's about the only time you'll use it. Then at level 22, you want to pick up Firestorm. This will only affect enemies that are already burning via your base pyromancy power Ignite, for instance, or any other method such as a flamer, etc. Firestorm will target an already burning target and allow you to hit anybody adjacent to them with further fire damage. A little situational, but I like it. Now at 25, you want to pick up Backdraft. This will cause any psychic power we use to deal damage with to cause a random enemy within 2 cells of the initial target to suffer half of that damage. This is really great later when we start getting some AoEs. Otherwise, it just gives us some extra damage off of our Ignite ability that, again, we're only really using if we're not able to close distance to the target. Now at level 28, I like to pick up Nimble. This is going to give us a 10% bonus to our dodge, which is pretty handy because heavy armor restricts your dodge chance, but also because increasing our dodge increases your lethality as an assassin, which is a lot to explain, but basically just know it's helpful. But also at that same level, we want to pick up Professional Acumen, which allows us to, every turn, make the first use of an assassin ability free, such as Seek the Opening. And then at level 30, we're going to pick up Molten Beam. This is a fantastic pyromancy ability that requires the previous ones we've picked up as prerequisites, by the way. But we're basically going to deal our double fire damage to any enemy within a 12-cell line. That will also reduce their armor until the end of combat. Plus, if that armor is reduced to 0, it will actually cause them to burn as well. And hopefully you can see as we've been moving along here, this ability combined with some of the previous things we've took to really spread around AoEs and increase damage dealt to other enemies can make Molten Beam a devastating attack. Though realistically, we are still going to be hitting things mostly in melee, but definitely keep this in your back pocket. Now at 31, you want to pick up Psi Rating 3 alongside Melting Armor. This will allow all the damage we do to both reduce the enemy's armor by 3% with every hit, plus once it reaches 0, it'll start peeling off any deflection they have as well. And then the last big one for this build is Sparks of a Greater Flame at 33. This causes all of our damage over time effects applied by us to gain a huge chance to crit. That can also be increased by further increases to your chance to crit. This ability plus all of our damage over time effects that should by now also be reducing armor and deflection at the same time is a great way to just demolish really high damage resistant, let's say bosses, etc. in the late game, because then we can apply our dots, which will last until the end of combat, which will slowly tick down their armor and deflection, etc., making them take more and more damage. So a great way to melt a boss over time if you're struggling. Some of them will just die before you get there. Now, from level 36 and on, we move on to the Exemplar. This is your last archetype, no matter what you chose beforehand, and it mostly consists of the abilities to continue advancing and picking up things from your previous 2 archetypes, alongside some other useful abilities. Now, by the time you get to Exemplar, your build is in place, so what you choose from here is largely up to you. I'm going to give a few recommendations, but there's no real need to go over it one by one. Really, the only important thing to remember is that once you hit level 40, you need to pick up Psi Rating 4, but other than that, it's pretty much fair game. Now, I like Thick Skin personally. This gives us an extra damage deflection, plus a 25% chance to parry, which is already going to be super high. So this particular ability makes us an incredibly effective tank. Lone Killer's pretty good. As an assassin, we're often going going to be moving away from our allies as we mow down enemies, which I'll explain in the combat section. But while we're doing that, we'll gain extra dodge chance and dodge chance reduction against enemies. Dueling Master for even more parry bonus is especially helpful. You can also pick up Incinerate, the sort of final hit, if you will, from the Pyromancy tree that will deal double your ignite damage plus half the damage from any burning enemies in the vicinity. So if you've got a bunch of burning enemies around, you can hit one enemy with this and deal just a nonsense hit. At some point, you might want to pick up Orchestrate Flames as well. This ability allows you to make sure that any target that is burning will do so until the end of combat without any chance to put it out. Burning Blood is also a great one. Whenever we use a Psychic power, any enemies adjacent to us take direct damage based off of our Psy rating, which can also be triggered by them attacking us, either burning, bleeding, or melee attacks, which are all some pretty great options. But again, Exemplar is just about furthering the build you've already made, further increasing your characteristics, etc. Make sure you pick up Psy rating at level 40 and you're pretty much golden after that, because at some point you're going to get to where you simply just don't need anything else and you're going to still have a ton of options to go, which is why you get so overpowered in the late game, because you're picking up a ton of stuff you just really don't need, as the level cap is 55, but you're likely to finish the game around level 50-51, unless you're just absolutely grinding for it. So something to keep in mind. And the last thing on that is, as you level up at certain milestones, you'll also gain extra action points, which is super handy and allows you to do more per turn, but those are set in stone, so it doesn't really matter. Now, from there, before we jump into combat, let's talk about gear. Now, for the most part, the best stuff you can find is obviously what you want, but there are 4 pieces in particular that make this build work exceptionally well. As I mentioned, all the way back in character creation, our primary stats are weapon skill, willpower, and strength. Anything that increases those is great and is a huge buff. To that end, there's 4 pieces of equipment that I want to talk about, starting with this helmet. The Eyes of Joyous, I guess. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but this increases our Psy rating by +1 against demons for each rank of Dogmatic, which comes up a fair bit and allows us to take our Psy rating all the way to potentially 9 against demons. And there are some high-profile demon bosses and encounters in this game, so that's pretty useful. And while it being only useful against demons might make you want to use another helm some of the time, at least as of now, this helm was bugged, and it just gave you that Psy rating all the time. But even if they fixed that, this would still be a great helm, though you'd realistically probably swap it in and out. But as you can see, this does require us to be Dogmatic, of course, and you do have to be a sanctioned Psyker, as it is technically possible to become an unsanctioned one via the Exemplar archetype. Now, you can get this helm pretty late in the game, Act 4 at the earliest, from Colony Management. It'll be one of the rewards you can get from, I believe, the mining colony in particular, which is going to be a recurring theme here. But our next piece, the armor, the Arbitrator Solomon Veer's armor, is the best armor in the game for this build. There is one piece of armor that is technically better, but only if you don't have a lot of coercion, which you should have been increasing as you leveled up. What makes this armor especially great is that we can get it pretty early on in the game in Act 2 via colony management. It is one of the options on, I believe it was the Janus colony, but I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. When you're doing the events for colony management, just keep an eye on the rewards. This is one of them, and you do not want to miss it. As being able to equip this piece of heavy armor that gives us 85% damage reduction plus 5 deflection right towards the start of the game is outrageous. This is more than double what most heavy armor has at that point in the game, which means already it's just insanely good. But what makes it incredible is actually its second special property, which is that its base armor property, which is to say deflection, increases with our coercion. For every 10 points we have in coercion, this gives us an extra point of deflection plus its base 5. And because of this, you could potentially get your armor deflection up into the 20s while also having a armor value of 85%. And what that means is that when you get hit, you'll take the armor deflection off the top, and then the remaining value will be further reduced by the armor, which is 85% damage reduction. And while some enemies do have armor penetrating abilities, this armor by itself will make you incredibly tanky. You'll take very little hits from this as long as you're pumping up your coercion. There is technically one other piece of armor all the way in Act 5 that can have better deflection than this, but only if you don't have good coercion. And the fact that you can get this early on in the game is just, again, outrageous. This piece of armor more or less makes this build in combination with a sword, which you can actually get even earlier. But first, we also have an accessory, Chains of Domination. This gives us a +5 bonus to our willpower that stacks until the end of combat every time we kill something, and we're going to be killing a lot of things with this build. In certain fights, it would not be unheard of to push your willpower well over 200 with this, which is going to make your pyromancy and stuff just insanely effective. You can pick this up in Act 3, so do watch out for it. But the best piece of all is the sword. Righteous Justice. The single best sword in the game, especially for this particular build, that we can also get from the Foulstone colony right at the start of Act 2. Once you start moving around the Coronis expanse a little bit, you're very likely to run into Foulstone as your first colony, and just a little bit of development into it will grant you the option to pick up Righteous Justice. For a dogmatic melee character, there is not a better weapon in the game, as it has a very high base damage value. What makes it great for dogmatic characters, though, is that for every rank of dogmatic you get past follower, we start ignoring the dodge and deflection and armor of Xenos, demons, and Psykers. And this sword, along with our assassin archetype that allows us to hit enemies for 10% of their max health in addition to our base damage hit, which is going to be exceedingly high because we're often just ignoring armor, dodge, deflection, etc. with this sword, is what is going to allow us to hit for potentially hundreds of damage with every single hit, and also hit 12 to 20 times per se once you get towards the end game. So to recap, when it comes to gear, Righteous Justice and Solomon Veer's armor, which both come from early game colony management, will give you just incredible gear very early on in the game that you can then go on to maximize the effectiveness of, which finally brings us to the combat portion of the build. Putting the pieces together, talking about how some of this works, and the nice thing about it is it's pretty simple, though I will say this build works best in combination with Cassia. Cassia on your team is going to allow you to use a buff specific to her that is going to raise your willpower and toughness, which is called Reveal the Light. She's the only one who can get it. It's part of her navigator powers. It's not strictly speaking required, but it is a great buff for this particular build. With that in mind, you want, in absence of that, just any officer into Master Tactician for Inspire to be able to cast Voice of Command on you, as well as Inspire. These are buffs that ideally you want to cast on our character before our turn actually starts, which is why we don't boost things like Agility, because we actually want to go a little later in the turn order with this guy. When our turn does roll around, though, it's actually pretty simple to play. Really, all we're going to do is on turn 1, cast Iron Arm. It lasts until the end of combat after you use it at the start of combat, so just the one time. And then, if necessary, we're going to apply Seek the Opening to an enemy to deal extra damage before running up and hitting them. Charge can help you close distance on enemies. You can use it even after you're out of movement points to give yourself extra movement if you happen to be having trouble closing the distance. Now, I would say the weakest part of this build is early game when you're not going to be able to kill a ton of things per turn. Because basically you're going to walk up to an enemy in range, kill them, ideally charge to a second enemy after that, hopefully kill them as well, and then early game that's pretty much your turn. Now in a perfect world where we're going a little bit later, you might be able to use Daring Breach, which thanks to the upgrades we picked up, allow us to remove the normal attack per turn limit, if you will, that lets us spend all our action points attacking and gaining movement points after we kill things to attack other things, which gives us a bunch of hits right away, which is great. But the absolutely perfect turn setup for this is when Cassia, or just any other officer really, gets their heroic ability first to then give you a turn before you start, because Finest Hour allows you to grant a teammate a full extra turn with the one caveat that they can make as many attacks as they have action points that turn. That is to say, they can attack until they run out of action points to do it. This is going to allow our character, who starts our turn that way, to effectively have Daring Breach, thanks to all of our movement, to kill enough people to then actually activate Daring Breach, which will then let us double our turn, dealing even more damage. That's like best case scenario in terms of dealing turns and damage, and when you can pull that off, you'll wipe the entire enemy team. But do keep in mind you can only use each character's heroic moment normally one time per combat. Now this build does have one weakness, especially early on, which is if you cannot close the distance, and that is where the pyromancy comes in. Pyromancy abilities can be used at range, which means in the situations you find yourself where you simply cannot reach an enemy this turn, that's where we're going to use our pyromancy abilities to set them on fire, triggering all of our damage over time effects. Another instance you might do that is if you have a lot of closely or perfectly lined up enemies, you can use something like Molten Beam to hit all of them at once, which can sometimes be more effective than going around and smacking everything with your sword, depending on the enemy layout. But those are generally the approaches to combat that we're going to take here, which pretty much sums up the build I used for my main character for my very first playthrough of the game with my review copy, and I found it to be exceptionally useful. So with that in mind, I certainly hope you enjoy it. I hope you found it helpful. Do let me know what you think about the build down below if you're going to use it on Heinrichs or yourself, but in any event, it was a really fun way to play the game, and I wanted to share it with everyone, so I hope you get some use out of it. That said, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.